Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on mixed methods research. We're going to be exploring what mixed methods research is and also why you might choose to use it, or importantly why you might choose not to use it as well. Hopefully you've been thinking about some research and some research questions that you might like to follow up on, and you might also have been returning to the paradigms that we discussed a few weeks back and thinking about where your type of research fits in. Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? Objectivist? Subjectivist? These kind of things. Well, mixed methods fits a little bit in the middle, but that also makes it quite a demanding form of research. It's not just about doing a little bit of quantitative and a little bit of qualitative. It fits between those things, so it's quite intensive. And so it's not so much saying, hey, this is all about mixed methods being a really great way of doing research and it's better than other approaches, but it's helping you hopefully in this video to understand what the differences are and why you might choose it or decide not to use it. So let's start with a scenario which illustrates how and why we might use mixed methods. So imagine a colleague, perhaps in a secondary school, has asked you to help understand what's happening with their new after-school ensemble program. After the first year, they've got some interesting things they're starting to note. It looks positive. The number of students who are engaging in classes has gone up, but they've also noticed that some students seem disengaged in sessions and that some aren't really fully participating. There's also quite a divergence in terms of the outcomes across different ensembles. So some groups are thriving, others are struggling. Your colleague wants to understand what's happening. They want to know why these patterns are emerging so they can make informed decisions about how to improve a program. So I want you just to stop the video at this point and think about the questions at the bottom. Is one type of data, quant or qual, able to give you the full picture that that person might need to be able to make changes? So stop the video here and think about how you might address the question. So welcome back. Assuming that you actually stopped the video, and if you didn't, please stop the video now and just have a think about the different types of data you might want to pick up on and use to answer this. And assuming that you have stopped the video, let's have a think about how we might answer the question. So could we answer it just with quantitative data? I mean, you could certainly measure attendance rates, and indeed it seems like your colleague has already done this. You count the number of performances, maybe even use rating scales to assess engagement level. This kind of data will tell you what's happening and might well help you identify some patterns. But would it tell you why some students are disengaged? Would it explain why some ensembles are more successful than others? Would it capture the students' lived experience on the programs, or the social dynamics within each ensemble, or how pedagogical approaches are different between different teachers? Similarly, if you use just qualitative methods, say interviewing a handful of students and observing some rehearsals, you'd get rich, deep insights into individual experiences, but you might lose that broader picture of how many things are happening and how many ensembles, our attendance is improving, these kind of things. So this is where mixed methods research can be really powerful. It's about combining both approaches. It's about integrating things into a single thing. Perhaps we might survey all of the participants to identify patterns. Then we might use that data to select students to actually interview more deeply. Of course, whether you'd actually choose mixed methods for a study like this depends on various factors. Your research question, the time frame, your resources, and also your epistemological commitments. So we're going to come back to many of these different things, but this scenario hopefully illustrates the kind of situation where mixed methods research might be able to offer something that neither quantitative nor qualitative approaches alone can provide. So let's move on to the next slide, where we'll look at what we're going to be covering in this video. So by the end of this session, you should be able to define what mixed methods research actually is, and crucially what makes it distinct from collecting either quantitative or indeed qualitative data. We're going to explore why and when you might use mixed methods, and equally important, when you might choose not to. You'll see how mixed methods relates to qualitative approaches we've already covered, such as case study and narrative inquiry, and also understand that mixed methods can enhance these methodologies, though it doesn't necessarily need to. We'll also look at key design decisions when planning a mixed method study, questions of timing, priority and integration, and finally we'll address some common pitfalls, particularly around small samples and generalizability, issues that are particularly relevant for MA level research. So before we dive into what mixed methods research is, we need to understand it philosophically. So some of you will remember we discussed earlier about research paradigms. These are the kind of fundamental assumptions about knowledge, reality, and how we come to understand the world. So for decades, the research community was somewhat divided into two, in what became known as the paradigm wars. On one side, you had quantitative research, typically working from positivist stances, arguing that research should be objective, measurable, and generalizable. Here, the researcher stands apart from what's being studied, measuring reality and assuming that reality actually exists. On the other side, qualitative researchers often come from an interpretivist or constructivist position. They argue that reality is socially constructed, that meaning is contextual, and that understanding requires getting inside people's lived experiences. Here, it might be argued that the researcher is inevitably part of that research process. Now, these aren't just arguments about whether to use surveys or interviews. They're really quite deep philosophical disagreements about the nature of reality and knowledge itself. Now, can we ever truly be objective? Is there a reality out there to discover? Or is meaning always constructed? These questions mattered and still matter if we're thinking about our research. Now, emerging from these two binary positions, we get pragmatism. And it's a philosophical response to something of this stalemate between these two positions. And this is crucial, pragmatism isn't just a compromise or a way to sidestep difficult questions. In and of itself, it's a legitimate philosophical stance with its own intellectual traditions, going back to thinkers like William James and John Dewey. So, what do pragmatists actually argue? Well, there are three things. First, they shift the focus from abstract debates about truth to questions of usefulness. The pragmatist asks, does this approach help us answer our research question? Does it work in practice to solve the problem we're investigating? This doesn't just mean that anything goes. It means method choice should be driven by research question, not by some kind of paradigm loyalty. Secondly, pragmatists argue that we come to know things through systematic inquiry and by observing the consequences of our actions. Knowledge isn't purely discovered out there, nor is it only constructed in our minds. It emerges through engaged interactions in the world. Third, pragmatists acknowledge that both construction and discovery may be valid ways of knowing, depending upon what we're studying. Some phenomena are indeed measurable and generalizable. Others are deeply contextual and interpretive. Often, both aspects exist simultaneously, which is why, when we combine methods, it might be so powerful. This philosophical stance is what underpins mixed methods research. It says, use what works to answer your question rigorously. So the diagram on this slide captures what we've just discussed. Mixed methods is often called a third methodological movement, not because it came third chronologically, but because it represents a third way of thinking about research. So you can see here that it sits between qualitative and quantitative paradigms, and it draws from both. The arrows are really important here because mixed methods is a bridge that connects these traditions. But you also need to notice that it's shown in its own distinct entity. It's grounded in its own philosophy of pragmatism. It's not just a blend or a compromise, it's a methodology in its own right, with its own quality criteria and its own ways of thinking about knowledge. So this means when we're doing mixed methods research, we're not abandoning philosophical rigor or trying to please everyone. Instead of which, actually, what we're doing is something far more complex. We're trying to integrate both approaches. We're trying to use both qualitative paradigms and quantitative paradigms together. We're mixing them and we're integrating them to get the best of both. So, what actually is mixed methods research? So here's a working definition which I've adapted from Cresswell and Planko-Clark. These are two really leading scholars in the field whose book you might want to look at if you're interested in doing mixed methods research. So mixed methods is a research approach in which investigators collect and analyse both quantitative and qualitative data. They integrate the findings and they draw interpretations using the combined strength of both of these sets of data to understand the research problem. So let's break that down because every part of this definition really does matter. First, to collect and analyse both types of data. Now this might seem obvious, but it's worth stating that you're genuinely engaging with both traditions. It's not just tokenistically adding a survey to qualitative data or throwing in a couple of interviews after statistical analysis. Second, and crucially, integrate the findings. Now this is really, really important if it's going to be truly mixed methods. It's not enough to do a quantitative study and then a qualitative study, reporting them in separate chapters. Integration means we're bringing these two different types of data together. We're putting them in conversation with each other, looking for where they converge and where they diverge, where one expands or explains the other. Third and finally, we're looking at drawing interpretations about the combined strengths. This is about creating what we call meta-inferences. These are insights that emerge specifically because you've combined both methods. The whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Finally, to understand research problems, notice it's driven by the problem, by the question. It's not by a desire to use a particular method, but rather by what the research question actually requires. This definition will guide us in everything that we're going to discuss today. So keep it in mind as we explore the different designs and approaches. Let's try to get a little bit more concrete further about what we mean by qualitative and quantitative data and what each can offer. So just for a second, I'd ask you just to pause the video and look through this table. Read through the comparisons between the different types of data approaches. Notice the differences in each column and think about what it tells us about the types of data involved and particular strengths of each. Right, so let's highlight a few of the contrasts that hopefully you yourself have spotted. Notice the question types. Qualitative answers why and how. It's about process, meaning and experience. Whereas quantitative answers what and how many. It's about scale, frequency, relationships between variables. What each tells us is particularly important. Qualitative gives you the story, the context, the meaning, the rich texture of lived experience. Quantitative gives you scale, frequency, and can identify patterns across larger groups. A qualitative study might reveal how a student experiences performance anxiety, whereas a quantitative study could tell you how prevalent that anxiety is across a larger number of people. Look at the strengths. Qualitative offers deep understanding of particular cases. Quantitative offers breadth and potentially generalizability, though that is going to require a larger sample and careful sampling techniques, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later. So it's not that there are better or worse, but it's more that different tools enable us to answer different types of a question. Your role here is to understand what each different type of data might be able to give us and provide us, and also to recognize what the different types of data won't allow us to recognize or to research. So let's drill this down into even more concrete examples and why you might actually want to use both types of data. So let's look at this example, thinking about why students might discontinue music at GCSE. So if you only had the quantitative data, it might lead you to know that 83% of Year 9 students discontinued music in this year. And whilst that's important because it tells you the scale of a problem, perhaps it doesn't tell you why this is happening. That's the thing that was kind of missing from this quantitative data. However, on the reverse side, if you only have the qualitative data, for instance, you might interview a few students who discontinued music. They might describe why they're not choosing to take GCSE music. Perhaps they're saying things about musical styles that they're required to study. If set works might feel irrelevant. So this would give you an insight as to why. But what you wouldn't know from that data alone is how widespread that feeling is. So is that feeling about stylistic worries, is that a primary barrier for most students, or is it just that you happen to interview the 3 or 4 students that had that particular concern? So what you might be able to do now with mixed methods is start to combine some of this data. So it might be that we expand the quantitative data, we look at different things here. So we might find out not only do 83% of students drop out from doing music at Year 9, but we could start to ask other questions on a survey and get quantitative data around the different types of reasons that the students put forward, or perhaps their relative importance for dropping out of music. But then what we might also do is follow up on that in terms of doing some more qualitative research. We could even use those survey results to help us pinpoint particular students who we want to talk to find out exactly why they decided either to take or not take music. So mixed methods gives us this broader, rounder description of exactly what's happening. Really key here is this notion of integration. Because if we have just purely separate quantitative and qualitative data, it's not giving us the full story. It becomes powerful when we start to combine the different types of data. So there are 4 key points where integration can happen in your research. First of all, it's going to be present, hopefully, if you do mixed research in your research question. So you need to design a question that requires both types of data to allow you to answer it. So rather than having separate quantitative and qualitative questions, you might have a question a bit like this. To what extent do students engage with practice, and what factors influence their practice habits? So as you'll see from that kind of question, that to what extent suggests some kind of measurement, whereas the what factors suggests we're going to be exploring meaning, why. Second, let's think about the integration, how it can happen in data collection. So you might use one type of data to inform how you collect the other, for instance. So we could use survey results to reveal patterns, and then that allows us to actually select students who we're going to talk to understand why a particular thing happens. Next way of doing it is thinking about the integration that happens during analysis. So this is where you're going to analyze data sets in relation to each other. So you might create what's called a joint display table. So this is a way of putting quantitative data on one side and qualitative findings on the other side, and seeing where they converge and perhaps also where they diverge. So we're using one type of data to help explain the other. Fourth, integration happens in the interpretation. And this is where we create what's called meta-inferences. These are insights that emerge specifically from combining both sets of findings. These are the conclusions you couldn't reach from either data set alone. It's important also to state what integration isn't. And it's really important to suggest that actually parallel reporting, where perhaps we have all the quantitative data in chapter 4 and all of the qualitative data in chapter 5, and that there's no real connection between them. That kind of presentation, that kind of dissemination, it's not integration. So it's more than simply having two separate studies bound in the same document. For it to be meaningful integration, for it to be mixed methods, there is deeper integration going on. Given how important integration is, what does it look like in practice? Well, I've already suggested one way of actually integrating data, which involves having joint display tables, placing your quantitative and qualitative data literally side by side. This can help the reader immediately understand how the two different types of data relate to each other, highlighting convergence or divergence in the data types, providing an immediate visible triangulation of your data. Another approach is to transform one data type into another. This might be described as quantizing or qualitizing your data. It's essentially turning quantitative data into qualitative data or vice versa. There are some different ways of doing this. One particular popular way of doing this is to take your qualitative data, let's say it's a series of interviews, and then as you're analysing it and you're looking for different codes, which mean different themes that appear, you start to count the relative frequency of them. So if we notice, let's say, that instrumental teachers through a series of interviews keep talking far more frequently about the challenges of getting students to practice outside of lessons compared with the challenges of getting students to sight read, this provides us some interesting data, quantitative data, and that's emerging from what was initially qualitative data. Another way of approaching it is to weave quantitative and qualitative data into our findings simultaneously. So whilst we're writing up our findings, we actually merge these two data types, allowing them directly to interact and provide meaning in the context of each other. So let's walk through a hypothetical, concrete example of how we might use mixed methods research. It's a little bit simplified, but I've done that deliberately so that we can really get to the core of how we might use mixed methods. So let's take a question such as, how do secondary music teachers experience curriculum reform? So let's imagine there's been a reform that's happened recently, and we're going to look at the impact that has on their practice. So you're going to notice, first of all, that this is asking both about experience, which suggests a qualitative inquiry, and about impact, which we're going to want to measure quantitatively. So here what we're going to do is we're going to use what's described as an explanatory sequential approach. We're going to go into more detail in a little while about the different types of mixed method approaches. But essentially what this means is we're going to have a quantitative followed by a qualitative series of data collection. And you're going to also see that on the slide there's a capital quant followed by a lowercase qual. Now the capitals indicate that quantitative is the dominant strand here and that it comes before the qualitative. So phase one, as we've highlighted, is going to be a quantitative strand. Let's imagine this is a large-scale piece of research. The n equals 340. That refers to the number of participants involved in the research. So in this case, we're going to be interviewing 340 music teachers, or we have surveyed rather than interviewed. We've surveyed 340 music teachers. So this is going to be a large sample size and it's going to be quite a large undertaking, but let's assume that we've got the resources to handle that and we've managed to reach out and collect that data. It's large enough, obviously, with 340 people for the statistical analysis to be meaningful, and it's going to be able to survey concrete things. So for instance, we might have asked questions around how much time teachers allocate to different activities, the types of curriculum content they're covering. Perhaps we could survey their confidence levels. We might also get them to rate things like student engagement. So let's imagine that our report, one of the key findings is that 67% suggest that there's decreased time for creative composition activities since the reform. So that's going to be a significant finding from our quantitative data. Perhaps there's also a negative correlation between the amount of prescription that's been added to the curriculum and also a report of job satisfaction from the teachers. So we've now got some quite solid quantitative data, but what it's not telling us is why. We don't know why these relationships exist. And that's what we're going to explore in phase 2 of this mixed methods research. So this is the integration point. We're using the data that we got from the quantitative strand, and we're now going to use it to set up our interviews, which are going to be the qualitative part here. Let's say that we actually use this very purposefully, and we're going to choose 12 teachers to interview, and we're going to very deliberately choose 6 with high job satisfaction and 6 who have defined themselves as having low job satisfaction or perhaps reduced job satisfaction. And this is going to be a strategic sampling based on that quantitative finding. And let's imagine that we're going to have some data emerging from these Y type interviews. So let's imagine that what we find out is that the teachers with the low job satisfaction felt that the curriculum changes have removed a degree of their professional autonomy. Perhaps they feel like they haven't been able to respond to students like they previously did. Perhaps they feel that they're delivering somebody else's rigid curriculum rather than being given a degree of professional standing to make their own pedagogical decisions. So now we've got both the quantitative data and the qualitative, and it's allowing us to do multiple things to get an integrated insight. We're finding answers that we wouldn't have got from either of the two types of data alone, and it's giving us particular insights both into the depth of the issue and also the quantitative, the reach of the issue. So on this slide, I want you to think about actually planning a mixed methods research yourself. And you'll see the starting point here is this idea that you're going to be recording lessons and then you're going to share it with your students between classes. So this could be a school situation where you've got whole classes, or perhaps it's a one-to-one lesson where you're recording performances or something. So pause the video here and just think through the questions at the bottom of the slide in terms of what you might want to measure, what you might want to understand, and also how the two different types of data might speak to each other. So pause the video at this point and then we'll return. So hopefully you did that and you've got some answers yourself about how you might measure things. So I'm interested to think about what it is that you thought you might measure. Perhaps you could measure how frequently the students actually use the video. So if it was in a class, you might have data about how many students actually watched the videos. You might have data about how long they watched for. Let's think about the qualitative data. So what might you want to understand about the experience? Well, perhaps you could do interviews with the students. You might be thinking about gaining data about how they used those videos. Did they watch them from beginning to end? What were they noticing about the videos? Were they looking at techniques they were using, or were they looking, let's say in a class situation, about the interactions they had with other students? And then how might we bring these two types of data together? Well, it might be that we get an alignment. So we might see that students who are watching more of the videos, actually we start to get data in terms of their improvement. And we might also see that that's coming about not just through them watching more of the video, but the types of ways that they're actually engaging with those videos, the things they're looking for in them. So we could bring the data together and get a combined vision of how the quantitative and the qualitative rub up against each other, how they integrate to give us a more complete picture of learning from these videos. So up to this point, we've been thinking about qualitative data and qualitative methodologies. But given we've been describing and thinking about mixed methods, I want us to imagine whether we could put quantitative data into these qualitative approaches such as action research or case study. Now let's just start thinking about what we said about both of these two approaches. So for case study, we described it as being about an in-depth exploration of a bounded system. We've talked about the importance of rich qualitative data to understand the complexity and context. And with action research, when we did action research in the past, we thought about it in terms of practitioner inquiry, about reflection on your own practice, about generating knowledge through those iterative cycles of action and reflection. Both of these are interpretive, they're really context-rich approaches, and they rely on small numbers of participants. In everything we've said so far, we've been valuing depth over breadth. So here's the question. Could you add quantitative data to them? Could you enrich them through quantitative data? Or is there a reason why that's actually banned, why it's not allowed? So I'm going to give you a moment. Please stop the video and just think through whether you could do this or not. What do you think? So, as you might tell from the slide that we've appeared at, the answer is that they can be paired and translated into mixed methods methodologies. But I'm guessing some of you might be thinking, well, wait a second, I thought that you couldn't, and that these are very much qualitative methodologies with their own logic and integrity. So why is it that we're now able to start adding quantitative data to them? You might be asking, doesn't that undermine what makes them distinctive? These are really good questions, and they kind of get to the heart of what mixed methods is actually about and what it means in practice. And key here is that adding quantitative data doesn't transform these into quantitative studies. And it also doesn't have to compromise their qualitative integrity. The qualitative methodology remains the frame. It remains the organising logic of your research. However, what quantitative data can do is add a breadth or a context. It adds a different dimension for understanding. So let's look at some examples. So with case study, we might use a survey as enrolment data. So imagine you're doing an in-depth case study of a particular community music program. The heart of your study is still going to be qualitative. You're still going to perhaps be using observations or interviews. But what we might want to do is to gather some quantitative data early on, some demographic information about participants, their attendance patterns over time, perhaps some satisfaction ratings from surveys. Now, this quantitative data isn't going to replace the qualitative inquiry, but what it is going to do is it's going to help to contextualize it. It's going to help you understand the scope and the scale of what you're studying. It might reveal patterns that your qualitative data then helps to explain. Similarly, with action research, you might have either a pre or a post-test score, or perhaps you might have some attendance data. So let's imagine that you're exploring a new approach to teaching sight reading. The core of your action research is still going to be that qualitative data. It's still going to be based on your observations, perhaps your interviews with students. But what you might want to do is to place some sort of standardized assessment at the beginning and the end so that you can measure a form of impact. So whilst the numbers, that quantitative data, it's not going to tell you why the approach did or didn't work for your action research, but what it is going to do is to provide data about impact. So it will tell you whether something actually measurably changed over time. The crucial point here is that the qualitative methodology still remains dominant. You're not doing a quantitative study with some interviews added. You're doing a case study or an action research that's been enriched with that quantitative data. So in this case, the qual is still in capitals and the quant is lowercase. The qualitative frames or organizes the research. The quantitative elements support or extend it. So you might be thinking now, okay, that's fine, but how am I going to describe this? Am I going to call it mixed methods, or am I going to call it an action research or a case study? So the answer to that is a little bit complex, and it depends how dominant the quantitative and the qualitative methodologies are, or that data is. So for instance, if you're doing a case study and that's underpinned fundamentally by your qualitative data, you might well call it a case study which is using mixed methods or drawing on mixed methods. So here, the qualitative methodology is the frame, and the mixed methods describes your data collection approach. You might also want to describe it using a notation system. So you might put the qual in big capitals, and then you might have an arrow showing that you're moving onto quantitative data. So the capitals indicate where the weight lies. However, you might also be moving towards having equal weighting between both strands. So if the quantitative and the qualitative are balanced, in that case you might flip your language and you might describe it as a mixed methods case study with mixed methods first. Or you might describe it as a mixed methods action research. It signals that both approaches, the quantitative and the qualitative, are central to your design. The crucial point is that the qualitative methodology remains dominant if you're going to be describing it as a case study or as action research, and you place mixed methods first if you're balancing out the quant and the qualitative. You might also want to describe in your methodology how you implemented this. So you might say something along the lines of, this study employed case study methodology and it's drawing primarily on qualitative data, but it's supplemented by survey data. So that's going to provide the broader description of your methodology so that somebody can understand why you're describing it as a case study rather than as a mixed methods approach. So we've seen that case study and action research can be enhanced with quantitative elements. But how about something like narrative inquiry? So could you use quantitative data to enrich your narrative inquiry? I want you to take a second or two just to think about it. So stop the video and have a think. Can we add the quant data to this type of approach? Hopefully, as you were thinking about this, you started to realize that actually mixing quantitative data with something like narrative inquiry starts to become a little bit problematic at best. So it's not that it's impossible, but it becomes philosophically complex and is very, very rarely done. So here's why. So narrative inquiry is deeply focused on the unique, on the individual story. So it's going to be valuing the particular over the general. It's not really trying to identify any patterns across cases or measure variables. Instead, it's trying to understand how this person in this context makes meaning of their experience through narrative. Quantitative methods, by their nature, aim to standardize and to measure, to find patterns that can be generalized. And so their goal really is to reduce complexity to variables and allow us to create comparable data points. So thinking about this and in terms of kind of epistemology, you see that they're really fundamentally different. Narrative inquiry resists the very thing that quantitative approaches require. Essentially, it's reducing the lived experience down to something that's measurable and comparable. Now, as I said, it's not that it's completely impossible, and some researchers have attempted it, but it really creates philosophical tensions. So if you're drawn to a narrative inquiry because of its commitment to honouring individual experience and resisting generalisation, then obviously adding quantitative data is at best a compromise and potentially is really kind of problematic. And it's an important lesson to think more broadly in terms of mixed methods. So it's not that anything goes. And just because you can combine methods, so you can add quantitative data to qualitative approaches, it doesn't mean that you should. So you need to think really carefully about the methods And you need to think about that philosophically. Is it philosophically compatible to add quantitative data to your research? If you're going to do it, you need to be able to justify how they work together coherently. It's an important consideration, as I said, to all things. So even though I've said that you can add quantitative data, take more of a mixed methods approach when you're doing a case study or if you're doing action research, that doesn't just necessarily mean that you should, and you really need to argue it yourself why you need to. So as we've begun to allude to, mixed methods actually has its own notation system that researchers use. You've already seen a little bit of this when we talked about the qual-driven case studies. So this notation system comes from Creswell and Plano-Clark, and it's widely used in the field. It might feel a little bit technical at first, but it's actually a very efficient way to communicate complex design decisions. So here's how it works. Uppercase letters indicate the dominant or primary method. Lowercase letters indicate the secondary or supportive methods. When both are uppercase, quant and qual, that signals equal priority. This is less common than you might think because genuinely equal weighting is difficult to achieve in practice. The symbols matter too. A plus sign, quant plus qual, means concurrent, so you're collecting both types of data at roughly the same time. Whereas an arrow means that the data collection is sequential. One phase follows the other. Well, this notation system might seem a little complicated and unnecessary, but it's actually quite useful. When you read mixed methods literature, these symbols immediately tell you what the researcher prioritized and how they structured their study. And when you're designing your own research, thinking in these terms can help you make clear decisions about timing and about priority. So, if you decide mixed methods is appropriate for your research question, you're going to face two fundamental design decisions, and they relate to timing and priority. So let's look at timing first. The questions here are, will you collect your data concurrently at the same time or sequentially in phases? This isn't just about logistics, although practical considerations certainly matter. It's fundamentally about how the two strands relate to each other and how you integrate them into your research. Concurrent designs make sense when you want to compare or validate findings. So you're gathering both types of data about the same phenomenon at the same time, then bringing them together to see whether they converge or diverge. Sequential designs make sense when one strand informs the other. Maybe your quantitative results reveal patterns that you then explore qualitatively, or your qualitative findings identify variables that you then measure quantitatively. Second area to think about is priority. Will you give equal weight to both approaches, the quantitative and the qualitative, or will one be dominant? Again, this should be driven by your research question. If your question requires both strands to carry equal analytical weight, then equal priority makes sense. But often, particularly in smaller scale research, one strand is primary and the other supports or extends it. There's no shame in that. Quant to qual design, quant uppercase, qual lowercase, where qualitative plays a supporting role, can be excellent research. It's about being clear and intentional about what each strand contributes. Now, here's something important for you as an M-level student to consider. Sequential designs are often more feasible than concurrent ones within your time frame. That's because you can learn from phase 1 before designing phase 2. And if you discover something unexpected in your, let's say, quantitative initial phase, you can then adjust your qualitative phase 2 to adapt to that change. Concurrent designs require you to do both strands simultaneously, which is harder, especially if you're still learning about research as a fundamental skill. So these two decisions, timing and priority, combine to create different design types. And we're going to look at 3 core designs that you're most likely to encounter and perhaps want to use. So the 3 designs on this slide are the core types of mixed method design that you're most likely to want to use. And they're the 3 which are probably most frequently talked about in the literature. The first, convergent parallel design, that's where you have your quantitative and qualitative, and you collect both types of data simultaneously, analysing them separately, then bringing the findings together to compare, validate, or get a more complete picture. Second is explanatory sequential design. That's going to be with your quantitative data first, leading into qualitative. You start with quantitative data to identify patterns or relationships, and then you're going to use your qualitative data to explain what you've found. Thirdly, we have the exploratory sequential design, and that's going to be qualitative data followed by quantitative data. So we're going to look at each one of these in a bit more detail. So let's start with the convergent parallel. So convergent parallel designs mean, as we've already stated, that you're going to collect and analyze both types of data at exactly the same time. Then you're going to merge or compare the results. You can see the structure on the slide. You'll notice that the quantitative and the qualitative data are collected at exactly the same time and are each analysed according to their own tradition, but at the same time as each other. Then comes the crucial part. Having actually analysed both types of data, you then bring them together, you compare them, you merge them, and you do your integrated analysis. So when would you use this type of design? Well, you'd use convergent parallel when you want to validate findings through triangulation. So you're getting at the same phenomenon from 2 different angles to see if your findings converge. It's also useful when you want a comprehensive understanding in a single time frame. So maybe you're doing a program evaluation and stakeholders want both breadth and depth of understanding relatively quickly. Or perhaps you want to compare different perspectives on the same issue. What do the numbers say versus what are people's experience? This design requires resources to collect both types of data simultaneously. You're going to need to have access to your participants for both things like surveys and interviews. It's also analytically demanding because you need to be competent in both traditions before you're ready to integrate them. So, this is convergent design, both strands happening simultaneously, each contributing differently, but in complementary ways to your insights. So let's look at explanatory sequential design next. This follows a 2-phase structure. You're going to have your quantitative first, and then you're going to move on to the second phase where you collect and analyze your qualitative data. So you start with the quantitative data collection and then its analysis, and then you use those results to select cases or refine your questions before moving on to that qualitative section or phase. This is the design we saw in our worked example earlier, the curriculum reform study, where survey identified patterns, then interviews explained the mechanisms behind those patterns. So when might we use explanatory sequential? You'd use this when you need to explain unexpected or interesting quantitative results. So maybe your survey reveals something surprising. For instance, students who practice less frequently actually report higher enjoyment. So this needs explanation. Or perhaps you want to explore the mechanism behind a statistical relationship you found, say a correlation between ensemble participation and academic achievement. But to do that, you're going to need to know why that relationship exists and that's where the qualitative data is important. So this design is also useful when you have time for two distinct phases and you're able to be patient about getting your final insights. Obviously, it's going to take more time because you've got a sequential phase of quantitative followed by the qualitative. The quantitative data might be seen as creating a map, and the qualitative data could be seen as exploring that territory. It's sequential because one set of data informs the collection and design of the second phase. So let's look at exploratory sequential design. This is the next major form of this type of research, and it reverses the order that we've just explored. So here you're going to have your qualitative data collection and analysis first, and then you're going to move on to your quantitative data. So when would you use exploratory sequential? Well, you'd probably use it when the topic is under researched and you need to explore first before you can meaningfully measure anything. So let's imagine you don't know what the relevant variables are going to be yet, or what questions to ask. So you need to first explore with qualitative data collection techniques, and then you're going to move on to collecting that broader quantitative data. So maybe existing surveys don't fit your particular context, so you're going to need to develop your own based on what matters in your setting. Or perhaps it's when you want to test the generalizability of qualitative findings you've identified. So let's say you've identified themes or patterns in a small sample, and then you want to know if that's widespread and representative. So the integrated insights combine qualitative depth with quantitative breadth. You've developed an assessment framework that's grounded in practitioners' actual values and practices, and you've tested whether it works across a larger population. Qualitative exploration identifies what matters, and then the quantitative extension tests how widely that applies. So this is exploratory sequential design. Before we move on, I just want to look at some slightly more complex mixed method designs, which are kind of beyond the three core ones we've just explored. I'm not going to explain them with the sense that you're likely to use them, but more because you're going to encounter them as you're doing wider reading. So let's look at them one by one. Multi-phase designs. These involve multiple sequential and concurrent strands over an extended period. They're common in large-scale research programs, where something like an action research project happens over a period of perhaps months or years. So for instance, a longitudinal study of a music education program might include some baseline surveys, periodic observations, annual interviews, attendance tracking, and that's all woven together over several years. These are ambitious in terms of research projects, and they're not typically feasible for somebody studying at your level, but you're likely to come across them being discussed in the literature around mixed methods. The next design is embedded designs, and like the name suggests, they nest one type of method within another. So the classic example is a randomized controlled trial. It's primarily quantitative, but you could embed qualitative data within it to understand participants' experiences of the interventions. So the quantitative strand dominates and provides the structure, but there's qualitative data nested within it to add depth. So you've got one method supplementary to the other, which provides the primary framework. Transformative designs are explicitly guided by social justice frameworks. So here, the commitment's towards advocacy and addressing inequality, and it's going to shape the design decisions and the methods which you're going to use. It might also dictate whose voices you centre on, how you're going to interpret findings, and what counts as valid knowledge. You might well choose to use participatory methods, involve community members as co-researchers, and design the research explicitly to challenge power structures. The mixed methods here serve for transformative aims. So as I said, I mention these not because you're likely to use them, but because you might well encounter them as you're doing wider reading. I want to just return back to the three core designs we've just covered for convergent, explanatory sequential, and exploratory sequential. These are going to serve you for most of your research questions, and they're the three types you're most likely to pursue if you do mixed methods. So let's move on to see if we can apply what we've just learned. So here's a scenario to test your understanding. Let's imagine you want to investigate the factors leading to student success in graded instrumental exams, whether that's ABSR, Trinity, or another examination board. I'm going to pause here before I offer any thoughts, but I want you to consider these three questions. What would you want to know? So think about the research question itself. Are you asking about the prevalence of certain factors, about students' experiences or exam preparation, about relationships between practice habits and outcomes? Because your research question here is going to shape everything else. Having thought about your research question, then think about which design you might use. Is it convergent, explanatory, or exploratory? Which one might work best? Think about the logic of each design we've discussed. Does this need to have both types of data simultaneously? Would you want to measure something first and then explain it, or would you want to explore it first, identifying factors that matter before measuring them more broadly? Crucially then, I want you to think about why. What's your reasoning for picking the particular approach you're going to use? So pause the video, think about it, maybe jot down some notes, and then when you're ready, restart the video. Okay, so I hope you took the time to pause the video and actually think this through. Perhaps you rewound the video a little bit just to see what the different types of research design were and just to familiarize yourself with them. But let's think through how we could approach this. The first thing to say is there's actually no single correct answer. There's not a right or a wrong here. Different designs could work depending upon your specific research question and the context. But let's have a quick look at some of the options. So one approach would be the exploratory sequential. So we'd start off with qualitative data and then we'd move to quantitative. So why might we use this? Well, maybe because we're thinking about success factors, and that's quite open-ended. So we might have assumptions about, let's say, things like practice time or the quality of teaching or parental support. But we don't really know what factors students and teachers are going to identify as crucial. So you might start off with qualitative interviews with successful exam students and perhaps also their teachers. So through those, you're going to start to see what these people attribute their success to, or perhaps what barriers they overcame, what made the difference. From that exploration, perhaps you've identified some key factors, maybe things like strategic practice rather than just putting in lots of hours, or perhaps some specific technique preparation. Then what you could do is start to develop a survey based on those factors, and you're going to distribute it to a far larger sample to see how widespread these factors are and whether they correlate with exam grades. Alternatively, you could flip it, and perhaps you could use an explanatory sequential design where you're going to start off with the quantitative data first and then move on to qualitative. So maybe you start by gathering quantitative data, let's say exam grades, practice logs, lesson frequency, years of study. You analyse this and you start to find patterns. Perhaps students who have shorter, more frequent practice sessions outperform those with longer, regular practice. So this starts to become interesting. You can find some key themes, but at the moment you might have correlations, but you don't know why these things correlate. So in phase 2, you're going to interview some students, let's say, with different practice patterns to try to understand the mechanism. What's that correlation? Why is it effective? You might even have picked a convergent parallel approach where you're doing quantitative and qualitative at the same time. So here, as we said, you're going to simultaneously gather exam data, let's say, and practice logs, while equally interviewing students about their exam preparation. You're going to be doing that at the same time. Once you've collected that data, you're going to analyze those two types of data separately, and then you're going to integrate them, bring them together to see how they triangulate to match your findings. The key thing here, whichever one you picked, and all three of these is possible, is did your design match your question? And did you also take into consideration practical constraints, let's say time or access to participants, perhaps even your own methodological strengths, or even perhaps your paradigms, your preferred paradigms? In here, there's no best design in the abstract. There's only sort of what might be considered as the most appropriate design for your particular inquiry. So this kind of thinking, considering different possibilities, weighing their strengths and limitations, and then making intentional choices, is exactly what research design is about. And I've spoken about it a few times, that whilst there's some broad rules that you have to follow, I kind of think of design or research design as an artistic practice almost. So here are a set of rules, and we bring them together, and then we need to think about how we might creatively use these approaches to get to the answer, to get to the data, to be able to explore the phenomenon that will give us answers to our questions. So now I just want to move on to something really important, because we've talked very, very briefly about quantitative data. And I want to address something that I see quite a lot in terms of students' work where there's quantitative data involved. And I'm going to call this the n equals 4 problem. So the first thing to note is n equals 4 means that the number of participants involved is 4. So let's imagine this. A student conducts a small qualitative study, let's say interviews with 4 teachers. So there's your n equals 4 teachers. Now that's absolutely fine, particularly for qualitative research. But then the student goes on, when they're writing up their research, and they start to apply quantitative language to that small sample. So they might say something like 75% of the participants agreed that the intervention was effective. Now technically it's mathematically correct, because obviously 3 out of 4 is 75%. But what it does is it creates a false sense of statistical authority. It makes it sound like there are generalizable evidence, when actually all that's happened is that 4 people have been talked with. So why is this problematic? Well, first it misleads the reader about generalizability. When someone sees something like 75%, they unconsciously associate that with a large-scale survey, and they start to think about it being statistically significant. However, as we know, these findings probably don't apply broadly. This was only 4 teachers. Possibly they're all from the same school. Maybe they all volunteered, so they're all enthusiastic about the intervention. Secondly, it violates the logic of both qualitative and quantitative research. If you're doing qualitative research, you've chosen an approach because you value the depth, the context, the particularity of it, not because you want to make statistical claims. If you're doing quantitative research, you've specifically designed for an appropriate sample size, and you're suggesting that this sample is representative. In the way that this kind of data is presented when you're using the 75%, it's an awkward middle ground. It doesn't really serve either tradition well. Thirdly, perhaps most importantly, it undermines your own credibility as a researcher. It suggests you don't understand the difference between small sample qualitative work and large sample quantitative work. When we're marking your work, we really do notice this. I've come across this a few times, and it always raises questions about the student's methodological understanding. So let's be clear about what actually makes findings generalizable. So if you want to make statistically generalizable claims, if you want to say that this percentage likely reflects what's true in the broader population, you need to have 3 things. Firstly, you're going to need to have a large sample. How large depends on your population and what you're studying. But we're typically talking about trying to get, let's say, somewhere in the region of at least 100 participants. You need to have enough people that patterns can emerge reliably and that individual variations don't skew the results dramatically. Secondly, you need a representative sampling. Your sample needs to actually reflect the population that you want to generalize about. So if you've just simply sampled whoever's volunteered or whoever you could easily access, your sample is inherently almost certainly biased in some way. Thirdly, you need appropriate statistical analysis. You need to use the right statistical tests, check assumptions. You need to know what your data can and cannot tell you. Now, the reality for M-level research is that typically you're going to struggle to meet all of these requirements. You've got limited time to do your design, to conduct and analyze, to write up your research. You also have limited access to large populations. You're often going to be working, let's say, within your own teaching practice, perhaps your own institution or your own network of friends and colleagues. So you're going to have limited resources for undertaking large-scale data collection. If we're honest, you're not a funded research team with research assistants, which is typically how this type of data is collected. So these are real constraints. They're not a failing on your part as a student, they're just the practical realities of undertaking this type of research. So most M-level dissertations can't claim statistical generalization. And that's absolutely fine because there are going to be other forms of valuable research contribution you can make. The kind of question is though, what do you do instead if you want to collect quantitative data? So I would suggest that the responsible approach is to be honest and clear and as transparent as you can when using quantitative data. So if you look at the slide, you can see there's a difference here in how things are written up. Instead of writing 75% of head teachers raise concerns about funding, you could write 3 out of 4 head teachers I interviewed raise concerns about funding. Or instead of 50% of students describe feeling anxious about performance, you could write 2 of the students described feeling anxious about performance. If you do this, it's honest, you're talking about what you actually did. You did, for instance, talk to 4 head teachers, and 3 of them honestly raised concerns. And that is valuable information. But it's important that you're not making a statistical, and even less a generalizable claim about all head teachers. If you use the approach that I'm mapping out here, this kind of responsible approach, it's methodologically sound. You're not claiming something your data doesn't support. Equally, it's more compelling. There's actually more power in saying 3 out of the 4 head teachers I spoke to, rather than hiding it behind a percentage. It acknowledges the qualitative nature of your work. Finally, it also respects your reader. You're being transparent about your sample size. You're allowing them to judge the transferability of your findings to their own context. And this is particularly important in qualitative research, where honestly the goal probably isn't statistical generalization anyway. It's this nature of transferability. Transferability really suggests that the reader can assess whether your findings might transfer to their own context based on the rich descriptions you provide, which is why when we're doing qualitative research, it's so important to give context. So it's a different form of using quantitative data, but it's equally valuable, and it is more likely to lead to an actual valid and meaningful research contribution. So if you have a small sample, and you often will, particularly at the level that you're studying at the moment, you can simply embrace that. You're going to use simple counts, be transparent about the numbers, and focus on depth and richness of analysis, rather than trying to create a false statistical authority. As I keep on returning to in this slide, remember, quality, honesty, and appropriateness of claims matter far more than impressive sounding percentages. So let's start to talk practically as we're coming towards the end of these slides, and start to think about what it means for you as a researcher and how you might approach doing this type of research. So the first thing to say is that I would suggest the most feasible approach for you is to really think about focusing on the qualitative component and making this the most substantial and rigorous aspect. So you're going to use the qualitative first and then use the quantitative component in a descriptive manner. So think about what this might mean in practice. Let's imagine that you might do interviews with, say, 8 instrumental teachers. Perhaps you're thinking about their assessment practices. So these interviews are going to be your primary data. It's going to be rich and detailed, and you're going to carefully analyse it using appropriate qualitative methods. So this is going to be perhaps the basis, the bulk of your analytical effort. Then your quantitative component might be a brief survey of all participants. So what instruments do they teach? How long have they been teaching? What context do they work in? Or perhaps you might gather some simple descriptive data such as how many students they teach, typical lesson lengths, exam entry rates. This quantitative data provides context, background, scope. It's going to help you describe your sample and situate your qualitative findings. But, and this is crucial, you make no claims about statistical significance or generalizability. You're using the numbers descriptively. You might say the 8 teachers in this study collectively taught, let's say, 140 students, with individual caseloads ranging from 8 to 35 students. It's contextual information. You're not claiming this is statistically representative of all instrumental teachers. You're just adding context to your own qualitative data. The integration shows how numbers contextualize your stories. Maybe your qualitative data reveals that teachers with very large caseloads describe different assessment challenges than those with smaller caseloads. The numbers help you see diversity within your case. The interviews help you understand what that diversity means. This is a realistic mixed methods approach for your level of ability, for sort of M-level research. The qualitative work maintains its integrity and depth, and the quantitative data adds a dimension of understanding without requiring large samples or complex statistics. And you integrate them meaningfully by showing how they illuminate each other. To be fair, I think this is achievable, and it's also rigorous. It can be excellent research. You're not trying to do everything. You're being strategic about what each method contributes. Now, if you pursue mixed methods, let's think about what high quality research is going to look like. So, whether you're doing mixed methods or evaluating mixed methods research, there are probably 4 things to look out for in terms of what might define quality. The first is about the coherence of the research design. Did it have a clear rationale for mixing the methods? Is it clearly explained why it was necessary? So you need an appropriate design choice for the research question. The design should follow logically from what you're trying to find out. And you need a systematic integration plan as well. You can't just hope the integration will happen. You need to design for it, and you need to do that from the very start. Secondly, we need to have methodological rigor. Each component, the qualitative and the quantitative, must meet the quality standards for that tradition. Your qualitative work needs to demonstrate credibility, transferability, dependability, all the qualities that we've discussed in various videos about qualitative research. Your quantitative work needs appropriate sampling, valid measurements, correct statistical analysis. This is demanding because you need competence in both traditions. You can't be sloppy about qualitative work and hope that the quantitative, for instance, is going to compensate. Each strand needs to be rigorous in its own terms. You need transparency about the procedures and the decisions. How did you sample? How did you analyse? What decisions did you make and why? This transparency allows readers to assess the quality of your work and the credibility of your findings. The third dimension of quality is the integration quality. Remember, integration is fundamentally what makes mixed methods actually mixed. You need clear integration points. Where exactly you bring the strands together, you need to be explicit about this. You need meaningful insights from combining that data. The integration should produce understandings you couldn't get from either strand alone. If your quantitative and qualitative findings simply sit next to each other, saying the same things in different ways, it's not particularly valuable and it's not high quality mixed methods research. The power comes when one explains the other, or when they reveal different dimensions of the same phenomenon, or when their divergence allows it to highlight some form of complexity. You need to acknowledge convergence, divergence, or expansion. When the findings converge, both point to the same conclusion. You've discovered triangulation, which strengthens confidence. When the divergence, seemingly the different things, contradict each other, that's important because it suggests complexity that needs explaining. When one expands on the other, adding a dimension that the other couldn't capture, that's valuable and it's complementary. You need to be explicit about what you're seeing and what it means. Fourth, and finally, interpretive rigor. This is about the quality of your conclusions. You should be creating meta-inferences, interpretations that draw explicitly on both strands together, not the survey showed X and the interview showed Y, but rather the combination of survey and interview data suggests Z, something that emerges from the integration. And you need an acknowledgement of your limitations in each strand. Maybe your quantitative sample wasn't perfectly representative. Maybe your qualitative sample was limited to volunteers. You need to be honest about what each strand can and cannot claim, and therefore what the integrating findings together can claim. Good mixed methods research is demanding because it requires excellence across all 4 dimensions. But when done well, it can produce really significant insights that genuinely advance understanding in a way that any single method could not. So having spent quite a long video explaining mixed methods, I want at this point to really think about whether you should use it or not. It might seem counterintuitive, but actually it's really important just to look through this list if you're thinking of doing mixed methods and to ask yourself honestly, should you be using it or not? So I'm not going to read through the list because I think you can probably do that yourself, but just be aware that it's here. I think really important though is to remember that, as we've got at the bottom here, well executed single method study is better than a poorly executed mixed method study. Mixed methods is complex, it's hard to undertake, so you're going to have to be ready for that. And something that's simpler but might lead to more coherent outcomes is likely to be a better way to go. So you really need to ask yourself, will combining methods give me insights that one method alone can't? I think that's a critical question to ask yourself, and it might be a good reason to reject mixed methods. So, having given you a whole variety of reasons why you possibly shouldn't do mixed methods, it's useful just to flip this at this point and say, actually, there are some good reasons for choosing a mixed methods approach. First of all, a comprehensive understanding. It combines breadth and it combines depth. It's one of the few approaches you can use to get the what and the why, the scale and the story. Next, it quite often can lead to stronger conclusions. So when findings from different methods converge, it increases your confidence in your findings. When they diverge, it reveals complexity and might well prompt deeper analysis. Next, you can use it to answer really complex questions. Some research questions genuinely require both a what and a why, both a measurement and a meaning. Mixed methods allows you to address these questions directly, rather than leaving one part unanswered. Fourth, practical insights. For practitioners and policymakers, mixed methods often provides the most actionable understanding. That's because you know what's happening at scale and you know why it's happening in practice. That combination enables better decisions about, let's say, intervention or program design or policy. Next, it offers methodological flexibility. Mixed methods adapts to diverse research questions. It's pragmatic. Use what's working for your questions rather than being constrained by a methodological orthodoxy. In music education specifically, mixed methods is particularly valuable for program evaluation, intervention studies, and understanding complex educational phenomena where both individual experience and broader patterns matter. So, to summarise and to just reflect on what we've covered over the course of this video, we've identified that mixed methods is a distinct methodology. It's not just about doing both. It has its own philosophical foundation in pragmatism, its own design logic, its own quality criteria. So you need to understand it as a coherent approach, not just a combination of two approaches. We looked at the fact that integration is what makes mixed methods. Without meaningful integration, without bringing both quantitative and qualitative findings into dialogue, you're just doing two separate studies. Integration happens in research questions, in data collection, in analysis, and in interpretation. Pragmatism guides us to use what works for our questions. So your research question should drive your methodological choice. It's not about some paradigm loyalty or assumption about what's better. You need to ask yourself fundamental questions about what your actual research question is and whether this type of research could really help to answer it rigorously. You can enhance qualitative methodologies with quantitative elements. So case study, for instance, or action research, and also some other qualitative approaches can incorporate quantitative data whilst maintaining their qualitative integrity. The qualitative methodology provides the frame, and the quantitative data adds context or breadth. Another thing to consider, we need to make sure that we avoid the n=4 trap, which we discussed. So we need to be honest about generalizability. We're not going to use statistical language with small samples. We're going to use simple, transparent counts. We're going to focus on depth and quality of analysis rather than false claims of generalizability. For MA research, qualitatively driven designs are the most feasible, and we need to recognise that this can be excellent research. Lastly, we're only going to use mixed methods if it will genuinely add value to your study. We need to recognise that a well-executed single method study is better than a poorly executed mixed method study. So give yourself permission to choose what's appropriate, not what sounds impressive. Remember, as we stated a bit earlier, good research is about rigour, it's about appropriateness and meaningful contribution. Here are a list of books which you might, and journal articles which you might want to look at. They're the references in these slides, and some of these are really core texts. If you want to find a book, particularly around mixed methods, then I would suggest you go look at the Cresswell and Plano Clark book, Designing and Conducting Mixed Methods Research. That's kind of the core text here, but the other ones hopefully will be helpful. Anyway, I hope that you found this video interesting and you've now got a broader understanding of mixed method research, and you can start to think about whether it's an appropriate type of research for your questions and what you're thinking of studying. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you hopefully in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.